Welcome back to Paleo Talks. We have a very special week this week, trying multiple people from different places. It's truly an international Paleo Talks this week. We have Dr. Angela Perri tuning in from the UK. How you doing, Angela?
Surviving lockdown.
Well, great to see you. Great to see you. We have Julie Meachen tuning in, Dr. Julie Meachen tuning in from Iowa.
Yay!
Yay! And just got her first shot. So very
Yay! That's what I'm really happy about today.
Yeah,
you can lift your arm though. That's good.
Yeah, I can. I can lift my arm. It's not that swollen yet. It's still okay.
And today's topic is just, I think, one of the most exciting papers of the year, really, when it comes to quaternary paleontology. And it's about the origin of direwolves. And it's just fascinating, this group of researchers that sort of came together to do this. And we'll come back to that in just a second, but let's jump over to David so he can remind everybody how the show works. David's our science communicator.
Sure thing. Thanks, Blaine. Excited to be here, excited to talk more about this really cool research. As is the usual format, we're going to start here in just a minute by having our guests give their presentations. Today is going to be a little bit different because we have sort of a panel of people. It might be more discussion based, and we might add a little bit of extra time at the end of the program to give some extra time for questions and such, since there's going to be a lot of people wanting to chime in. So at some point during the program, as we get closer to the end after the presentation, we're going to open it up to questions from the audience. The back end of this program will be Q&A. So when that comes, we'll remind the audience to go ahead and start leaving your questions in the comments of the Facebook video. And as always, if you can't leave a comment on Facebook for whatever reason, I will be keeping an eye on the Gray Fossil site, Twitter, and Instagram accounts. So feel free to send us a message there as well.
All right. Thank you, David. This project, I say it's one of the most exciting of the year, if not the most exciting, in my view, of quaternary paleontology, but it's definitely not a project that happened quickly. And I remember getting looped into it when Julie was visiting here and was looking for potential direwolf specimens, which we were able to help contribute to that. And that's how I became part of the project. And Angela, you're the senior author on this project, but how many authors overall did we have? Do you remember? It was a lot.
56.
Okay,
56.
yeah. And so it's just incredible when you get this many minds together working on a project. Yeah, so thanks so much for leading this in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, as you said, it's a really exciting project, really international, lots of different labs, lots of different people came on board at various stages. And it was really a project that I think many of us, including yourself and Julie, started working on kind of a long time ago in the collection of various materials. I mean, I remember being Illinois State Museum and talking to Chris about this years ago and looking at material there. So yeah, I mean, I spent years going around collecting specimens from various locations, and Julie was doing the same. And then our colleagues in Australia, Kieran, was doing the same. So, I mean, it was just kind of one of those things where we all happened to be doing it at the same time, and we came together, and a little bit of luck, a lot of teamwork. And yeah, I think honestly, you know, when people ask me about this paper, I would say that we in no way expected the results that we got out of this paper to be, you know, what would happen when we looked at direwolves. So it was just as exciting for us, these results, as it is for everyone else.
It was exactly what I was thinking it was going to be.
I'm sure, yeah.
All right,
I think I remember I told you what it was going to be at SVP several years ago when we had some preliminary results, and you were like, what?
Every paleontologist's first reaction, that can't be right. What? That doesn't make any sense.
Fantastic. Well, I just want to remind everybody, we're coming to you from the Center of Excellence in Paleontology at East Tennessee State University here in Johnson City, which we oversee the Gray Fossil site and a lot of Pleistocene research as well. And we have Dr. Chris Widga with us as usual too. So hey, Chris. And we usually get into sort of how you got into paleontology, but we have multiple guests, and you guys, both of you have been on the show before, so we'll skip that part. And Angela, if you can go ahead and bring up the PowerPoint presentation,
Sure.
and we can just sort of jump into this and start talking and try not to make it 3 hours long.
Let's see, hopefully this works. Does that work? Should I hide something? Can you see your own faces here or no?
It looks perfect.
Okay, great. All right. So yeah, should we just launch into this? When we started this project, I desperately wanted to get a Game of Thrones reference in there. Everyone told me we can't say Stark in the title, like nature, science are not gonna go for that. But now here I am, I'm putting Stark in the title. So of course, I'm very excited about Game of Thrones and the tie to Direwolves, and more importantly that I guess Game of Thrones has really put Direwolves on the map as far as the kind of public consciousness of a direwolf being a thing. What I'm excited about, I mean, I don't know what you guys have had as far as reactions about this, that a lot of people didn't know that direwolves were a real animal, that they're not kind of a mythological creature that's just part of Game of Thrones. I also want to put out there, because I always hear that that I'm well aware that direwolves were not in Game of Thrones first as popular culture. Let's just throw out Grateful Dead out there. Let's throw out Dungeons and Dragons, throw out every kind of version of direwolves that have been out there. But definitely I think Game of Thrones kind of set the scene for everyone talking about direwolves now. And of course, anyone who's been to La Brea, which many of us have been to many times, and find really exciting this kind of wall of direwolf skulls and over 4,000 individual direwolves there, which are really exciting and incredibly useful. Julie, I think you've probably spent a lot of time at La Brea looking at this material, and yeah, I've definitely been there as well, and just it's a kind of overwhelming amount of material there. I also think kind of the starting point for a lot of the conversations about direwolves and their relationship to gray wolves and what are direwolves is interesting to kind of look back at the depictions of direwolves and how we think the kind of consciousness of what a direwolf is over the decades. And I feel like there's a lot of really interesting depictions of direwolves as essentially gray wolves. This has been our kind of going idea of what a direwolf is, essentially, right? This larger version of a gray wolf. Some people, I guess, would think of direwolves as being this kind of gigantic version of a gray wolf, but just generally a bigger version of a gray wolf, right? Blaine, do you want
both of you, Julie and Angela, have you experienced since this publication any disappointment from people when they learn that they're smaller than they envisioned them? Because I have.
Yes.
Yes.
Julie is probably the best person to talk to about that.
Yeah, I mean, people always think that and when I tell them they got them wrong on Game of Thrones, they're like, oh, like there's a lot of disappointment. Although the excitement they have when they find out they're actually real kind of counters the disappointment that they don't look like what they look like on Game of Thrones. So
yeah, I did tell someone the other day that probably Game of Thrones would have been more realistic if the direwolves were the kind of mascot animal of like the Dothraki or someone in the kind of southern the southern hemisphere, the kind of more southern latitudes. I guess it doesn't work as well to have it not be, but basically our going idea really has always been that direwolves are probably very closely related to gray wolves, maybe a sister species, a cousin species. Some people, I guess, have said that they may be even the same species, just a larger form. But this idea that, they're a gray wolf essentially in some way. And I really like Mauricio. I remember when I saw this depiction of direwolves, I thought it was interesting because Mauricio, who did my background, who did the kind of illustration for our paper, Amazing, the kind of new envisioning of what direwolves look like. I remember seeing this and thinking, this is a kind of different look for direwolves, a bit more reddish in the coloring. The faces look slightly different. And then some other paleo artists do these kind of depictions of what a North American versus a South American origin of direwolves may look like. And I remember when I saw this, I thought, oh, that's really interesting, thinking about a potential South American origin of direwolves and how that may affect kind of the phenotype of what we think of as the typical direwolf. So Julie, do you want to kind of, I'll kind of put these there, and you want to kind of take over speaking about kind of morphology and in general about the direwolf?
Yes, I was trying to unmute myself unsuccessfully. Thanks. So as a morphologist, I've studied lots of large carnivores, and direwolves are one of the things that I've looked at. And Blaine is also a carnivore morphologist, so he can jump in if he's got something to add to what I'm saying. But in general, Angela was right. People just, even scientists, looked at these bones, both skulls and postcrania, and thought, wow, this is just a really big gray wolf, and they must be closely related to gray wolves because their morphology is so similar. And sometimes it is hard to distinguish direwolf morphology from gray wolf morphology. There's this whole collection of direwolves at the Rancho La Brea Museum, which Angela was just talking about. And when they started digging these bones out, they realized there were also gray wolves in the collection, and the way that they would distinguish gray wolves from direwolves wasn't to do any kind of morphological analysis. It was just to look at the bones and be like, okay, this is big and robust, it's a direwolf. This is smaller and more gracile, it's a gray wolf. And now we know that approach might be a little bit flawed. And so one of the things I've tried to do as a morphologist is to try to understand what the differences are between direwolves and gray wolves and other canids using the morphology. And so instead of just looking at the morphology and saying, oh, yep, that's different, I've tried to quantify the morphology. So I've done these measurements, and I do both 2D and 3D geometric morphometrics to try to better understand the differences. And so this slide that Angela has up right now are some jaws from direwolves from Rancho La Brea. And as you can see, there are some actual differences in these jaws. They don't all look the same. The two that are kind of catty corner in the top left and the bottom right are both very robust looking. They're big. They're from different deposits, and the different deposits are different time periods. So direwolves have changed a lot through time. So it's not really simple what's a direwolf and what's a gray wolf at Rancho La Brea. In the bottom left-hand corner is a direwolf from a pit called Pit 13. We call this the Tough Times pit. Not only are animals smaller and sort of look stunted in this pit, but if you look at the upper right-hand corner, that is a jaw from the same pit, and it expresses this thing called pit wear, where clearly the bones were rubbing against each other. So this pit has some special stuff happening. So it's not always easy to determine what's a direwolf and what's a gray wolf at this site. Next slide, Angela. Thank you. So what I did was I actually put these jaws into something called a canonical variance analysis, or maybe you might know it as a discriminant function analysis. They're very similar. And this is from 2D geometric morphometrics of the jaws. You can see the outlines of each of the jaws. So in the upper left-hand corner, we have direwolves in blue circles. Upper right-hand corner are modern gray wolves in the green squares. And then in the bottom sort of middle area, we have something called a Beringian wolf, which is a wolf from Alaska that is closely related to a gray wolf. It is basically a gray wolf, a subspecies of gray wolf. But as you can see, these three wolves all fit in very distinct morphospace with their jaws. So it is possible to sort of distinguish them from their morphology, but it's not always possible to tell who is most closely related to who. And just if you're wondering, those purple diamonds are wolves from my field site, Natural Trap Cave. So you can see that they are actually falling with those Alaskan Beringian wolves, and we're working on that DNA now. So we'll have more on that later. Okay, next slide, Angela. Thanks. So additionally, we also look at the postcranial measurements of these wolves to try to figure out how they're different. Next slide. And this is a little bit confusing, but basically what my postdoc and I figured out by looking at all these different wolves, these different squares are all different iterations of what we've run with different elements. And so the direwolves are actually fitting into that little brown triangle. The modern gray wolves are in that blue area, and the Beringian wolves that were from Alaska and Natural Trap Cave are in that yellow sort of polygon. And just from this diagram, you can see that out of all of these wolves, dire wolves are actually the most disparate. There is some overlap in some different elements, like in the femur, there's some overlap, but dire wolves actually do fill out their own morphospace. So in hindsight, knowing that dire wolves are not very closely related to gray wolves it is not a super surprise. Although at the time we didn't see it. So it took this study to basically elucidate that fact. And you know, these dire wolves, what they look like is basically postcranially, they are shorter, they've got sort of shorter bones, and they're really robust. So they're really built for dealing with large megafauna, and their teeth are also more robust for sort of dealing with this large megafauna. And I think that's most of what I have. Blaine, do you have something to add to any of that? Okay, I think there's one more slide that Angela wanted me to go over. Oh, just skip through this. Should have taken this animation out, sorry. Okay, so Angela, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to do this one too?
I'll take it. I'll take it.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. I mean, I just wanted to ask you, Julie, just for my own, you know, personal query. What do you think about, will we ever get to the point where we, based on, you know, I'm an archaeologist, I'm not a person who does geometric morphometrics or anything like that. Will we get to the point, are we at the point that we'll be able to identify gray wolf versus dire wolf with basic metrics or by eye?
You know, that's a great question. I'm guessing we're not going to be able to do it well by eye. We haven't really been great at it so far. I mean, there are ways to sort of say, oh yes, for sure this is a dire wolf, for sure this is a gray wolf, but those wolves that are in that gray area, haha, pun intended, nice. they're a lot harder to do, and I think morphometrics does help. But as we found out, we're not really good at doing phylogenetics with morphometrics. I mean, I am not a phylogeneticist, so I can't speak to the techniques that they use or how to improve on that. But I feel like we've done not a great job of determining their phylogeny based on their morphology. So,
and just to follow on that, I think, you know, now that we know, sort of spoiling if you don't already know, what we're saying here is the dire wolf is not closely related to the gray wolf, is that, no, now that we know, we could look specifically, for example, more internal cranial anatomy, something that's not more driven by diet, that we might find potentially as a separator.
Right. Yeah. Well, I just thought I'd go through a very kind of simple, for those who don't have this background in knowing a lot about direwolves, or for those joining us who up until this presentation had thought direwolves were in Game of Thrones only. Just a little bit of the background of direwolves, being first found in 1854 in Indiana, originally named Canis primavis, but that was a name I think already given to doles. So that name was changed to Indianensis, and then again found in Nebraska, and that's when it was first named Canis dirus. And then in Mississippi and named Mississippiensis, and kind of sorted out that probably this fossil, those found in Indiana, and the dirus fossils are all probably of the same type. And then in 1918, Merriam came along and said, I think we need to take a look at this and perhaps call this specimen a Nocion dirus, that it can be, plus the ones he'd been looking at La Brea, that this is probably distinguished away from the genus Canis. So I always feel bad for Merriam, because really it feels like no one really took that seriously, and they were just like, no, John, that's not happening.
I think John Merriam would be posthumously excited to know that he was right all along.
I
So
know.
funny.
I love it. 100 years later, validation. And so Nowak calls kind of everything together, all of these various names, diarists. And then in 1984, the identification of this kind of Eastern and Western subspecies types. And then it feels like after Curtin, like there hasn't been a lot as far as taxonomy and movement in what we call Canis and the various subspecies of Canis since then. And I feel like hopefully our paper came along and kind of threw a wrench in that and shook things up a little bit. So some of the key questions that we were looking at in the paper really was, what is the relationship between direwolves and gray wolves, as we're talking about now? Where did the direwolves originate, which still a question, and when and why did the direwolves go extinct? So I'll let Blaine kind of jump in and talk about some of that.
So we're going to look at a few different fossils from the past and sort of phylogeny based on morphology. But when we talk about the Americas and different carnivorans, in many cases, we're looking at an interchange that's happening across Beringia. And so this route is something that was frequently used for taxa or different species to go back and forth. Next. And so if we go back sort of to this earliest record in the potential ancestor of Canis dirus and other members of Canis, we can look at some of Wang and Tedford's work and this phylogeny that they put together. And this is based on morphological phylogeny. And so it's a hypothesis based on that. And that allows us to move forward then and further test this hypothesis either through more morphology or through genetic work. And this species that we see back here in time that Mauricio Anton has depicted here, looking very sort of coyote or jackal-like, dates back to the late Miocene or early Pliocene. And many have thought that this is sort of the ancestor to all of these different members of the genus Canis. Go ahead. And so what happens actually with that one in the previous slide is that it shows up first in North America, but then moves into the Old World. And not completely into the Old World, but it does diversify in the Old World. And we start to get some early Canis that are showing up, like this one here, Canis chilensis from China. And then you start to get more and more diversification of Canis. So it's showing up in the Pliocene in the Old World, and then diversifying there and eventually making it into the New World. Next slide. And one of the potential ancestors of Canis dirus has been hypothesized to be this Canis ambrusterei, which is in North America by the early Pleistocene. So certainly this is something that's been looked at. And as we look at revising this type of phylogeny, certainly if Canis dirus is going to be in a new genus and Canis ambrusterei is an ancestor, if that is also correct, then you would have to go ahead and think about the genus names going back on the phylogeny as well. Next slide. And then we can look at sort of those sister taxa on this phylogeny to Canis dirus, the Naranjai and the Gezii. I'm probably really butchering the way those were originally supposed to be pronounced, but when we look at those and we see where those fossils are coming from, we can see that they're actually from the South American fossil record. And we also get Canis dirus in South America as well. And so this can really start to get us thinking about this American origin of potentially Canis dirus, and then tackling the hypothesis that has been proposed here based on morphology by doing the genetic work and seeing how much convergence may actually be in play in putting some of these together. All right. I'll stop talking.
Yeah, no, it's interesting to think about what happens to all of the Canis ancestors of direwolves if direwolf is not Canis. And that's certainly, I think, a question that our paper has brought up that is probably the next step in tackling this idea of large canid fossils in the Americas. So We have a map of locations in our paper, but I just think that Dundas did it right and did it so well in his 1999 paper. So we added some new fossils on top of this, but in general, this is kind of the location of direwolves across the Americas. You can see not a lot of instances in South America, quite a few, but in North America, many across Texas, California, Florida, across the Midwest, tending to be usually in kind of lowland environments. You can see a lot of them tend to be a bit coastal in Florida and California. And so, as Blaine said, there is this question of the origins of direwolves, and first whether the origin is in the Americas, and then if in the Americas, where exactly in the Americas. So recently, I guess it was just last year, then this paper came out talking about the first potential finding of direwolf outside of the Americas in China. Blaine and Julie, I'd love to get your thoughts on the idea of direwolves outside of China, or outside of the Americas in China.
So when I first saw this paper, this specimen, I thought, I'm not sure that it's a direwolf, simply because we've had all these issues, right, morphologically identifying wolves in North America, where we know there's direwolves. So my thought was that, sure, it could possibly be a direwolf. I can't rule out direwolf from this one tooth and this little piece of jaw, but I wasn't sold on the idea that it was direwolf, and I really still don't know if it's a direwolf. If it is, great. I hope they find more of it. But if it's not, it could be any other number of canids, including a new species that we just don't know exists yet. Blaine, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would right now say it's a possible direwolf, but I wouldn't confirm it as a direwolf based on the morphology that I've seen. As Julie mentioned, we have a hard time telling if a direwolf is a direwolf here in North America. And, even when we went looking for specimens, when I picked out potential specimens to be analyzed, I thought, well, this is possibly a direwolf based on the morphology of these teeth. But then the genetic work actually confirmed that it was something significantly different. So I wouldn't call it a direwolf based on morphology. I would call it, this needs to be looked at more carefully.
Right. And if it does turn out to be a direwolf, then, what that means for the movement of direwolves across Thuringia and their origins will be something that needs to be looked at kind of in a completely different light if we know that direwolves are now in the old world. So it's definitely an interesting kind of recent change. So kind of moving from the morphology and the paleontology to some of the DNA work that we did on the direwolves for this paper. So I think between all of us and all the labs involved, we ended up looking at, I think, 70 something specimens, testing 70 something potential direwolf specimens. The skull on here, obviously some of the best material is coming from La Brea, and we know that La Brea has a terrible, terrible record for DNA preservation. The tar at La Brea makes it incredibly hard to access any of the DNA from there, and a lot of the other specimens that we took a look at just failed in their DNA capture. But you can probably, Julie sees a lot of direwolves, Blaine, you see a lot of direwolves, Chris has seen a lot of direwolves. These are some of the direwolves I came across in my various sampling trips. And so some material is in really beautiful, nicely preserved condition, and then some material is just rough, often covered in all types of preservatives, or has been, completely dried out on the surface or some other reason. So, I have people often ask me like, oh, why only 5? And I'm like, we were so lucky that we got 5 samples out of the dozens and dozens and dozens that we tried, because this material is often just in pretty rough conditions. So first of all, I'll say our partners, we worked with a lot of great ancient DNA labs to to look at a lot of this DNA. Unfortunately, as I said, a lot of those failed, but people spent years and years and years attempting to recover DNA from some of these specimens. So the places that we did manage to recover DNA from direwolves were at the American Falls Reservoir site in Idaho. So 2 of our specimens come from that location. At Julie's site at Natural Trap, at Sheridan Pit site, Ohio. I think Sheridan Pit was that. I think that was the site that was originally labeled like a bear tooth or something. It turned out to be a direwolf canine. And then Guy Wilson, which is where Blaine kind of came on board and was involved. And so you can see some of the dates on those. The American Falls sites, both were beyond radiocarbon dating, so over 50,000 years old, but the rest of them, some of them are pretty young. And so the Guy Wilson specimen is now, I would say, the most securely latest date for direwolves now in the Americas at 12.8 calibrated. And so I guess we should say we did both mitochondrial and low cover nuclear genomes, and which something that's kind of exciting is to get a type 1 collagen sequence out of those as well. So potentially useful for paleoproteomics work and comparative work via the proteomics, which is a much easier process than the DNA. And so one of our first really, I think, interesting findings on the DNA was that we included whole genome sequencing on a black back and side stripe jackal, just to kind of complete the wolf-like canid comparative group that we were looking at. And these jackals have been kind of part of a recent revelation as far as what should be in the Canis genus, I would say. And so in 2019, it was suggested that they move to their own genus, Lupulella, and our findings confirm that they fall outside of what should be considered Canis, and that the Lupulella genus seems like a good fit. So that was pretty exciting. And then, of course, our findings with the direwolf, which was really, I don't know how you guys felt about it, but when I saw these results, I thought there must be something wrong. I was like, why are direwolves up there? That's very far away. That doesn't make a lot of sense. So essentially our findings were that direwolves and gray wolves shared a common ancestor sometime around 5.7 million years ago. Julie, Blaine, Chris, I want to get, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but like, what does that mean to you? You're all paleontologists. I'm an archaeologist, so it means something to me, but as a paleontologist, where did your mind go when you saw 5.7 million years ago?
My first thought was, oh my God, whoa, like how wrong could we have been as morphologists? Like absolutely wrong, just wrong. And it kind of blew my mind. And my thought was, oh my God, dogs are so convergent. This is crazy. How are we going to figure out any dog relationships in the past now?
Julie, just clarify when you say dogs.
So when I say dogs, I'm sorry, you're right, I should clarify. I mean all canids. So when I say dogs, I'm referring to every individual species in the family Canidae. So.
Yes, agreed.
Yeah, and when same kind of a situation, but I had a very similar thing happen with bears before, where it was like all of a sudden who we thought was related to who in the short-faced bear group changed dramatically, and that convergent aspect slapped us in the face that you can get this rather dramatic convergence going to completely skew your original idea of relationship. Yeah. 5.7 is still shocking to me because it seems really far back.
Yeah, really far back. What do you, as people who work on large carnivores and canids particularly, where does your mind go as far as reasons for convergent evolution and why this happened, and how is it possible that they're so morphologically similar?
I think they're just really good at what they do. They're really good at hunting prey. They found a morphology that works, and they've all sort of converged on it. And I'm making it sound like they've chosen this, but evolutionarily, they have all converged on it. And I think it's because it's efficient. It's clearly good for hunting the prey that they're interested in. And they probably, direwolves and gray wolves still probably had some similar prey sources. They probably overlapped in the types of prey that they were hunting, especially in the Pleistocene. So I think, I think that it's a great morphology. I mean,
It's a good shape.
it is. It works. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. Blaine, what do you think?
Yeah, I think another way to look at it is this is such a wonderful example of natural selection working towards a morphology that works with whatever you had to work with in the first place. And
Yeah.
so, and it gives us great caution and pause, I think, in how we interpret the fossil record when we cannot include ancient DNA.
Yeah, I definitely think did it make you guys think of other species that we think are closely related and we don't have DNA for yet?
Oh, yes. And it kind of made me realize that this story that paleontologists have been telling ourselves about who's related to who and who came from who, it kind of upended it completely. So there's this, Pliocene canid called Canis lipophagus that I've worked on before when I worked at Hagerman, and thought about extensively. And it's sort of coyote looking, and we always thought, oh, well, this is the species that gave rise to the modern coyote, and they're all related, right? Direwolves, gray wolves, coyotes are all sister species. They're all closely related. And now it's like, well, okay, now who is Canis lipophagus actually related to? Because we know that direwolves and gray wolves do not have an equal relationship. We know that they are not closely related. So who is lipophagus related to now? Is it related to the direwolf, which is more likely, I think, at this point, since it was here in North America. So it's totally made me at least rethink all of these canid relationships in North America.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we're lucky that we're able to work with both the fossils and work with you all on the genetic aspects to start seeing these convergent issues. And what I see it working moving forward is that these examples are going to spread out into looking at things that are older and being more cautious about how we interpret those older relationships. And so we're going to publish these phylogenies based on morphology, but having to keep in mind very much that this is just a morphological similarity sort of tree instead of necessarily a morphological phylogeny that matches the genetic phylogeny.
Yeah, it's crazy times, but
it's exciting.
Fun, right? exciting. So let's go back to Miriam, Julie, as you said. I just feel like, so what we did in this paper was really, we vindicated Miriam, right? I mean, we determined that Miriam was probably right, that Canis dirus should be a Nasian dirus, and that it should be removed from the Canis genus. And as we said, I really just feel like 100 years later, we did a good one for John Miriam. So I feel pretty excited about suggesting that it should go back to a Nasian. And I got an email just the other day from a random person saying, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna call it a Nasian in this paper I'm writing. I just felt like, there you go, do it. So another thing that we found in the paper, right? I mean, kind of part of what Julie's talking about is we looked at the potential for integration and interbreeding with direwolves and the other canis that we know were in the Americas, including gray wolves, coyotes, dogs, eventually when dogs show up, and kuan. And what we found when we looked at that also was incredibly surprising for me. Not surprising once you see the 5.7, but surprising that we found no evidence of interbreeding between direwolves and any of these other canis. So, maybe one of you want to speak to what exactly that means. Do one of you guys want to jump in and just talk a little bit about, you know.
Sure, I can jump in. So just from my own experience with the dogs at Natural Trap Cave, so the Canids at Natural Trap Cave, we weren't sure what they were. The original descriptions of them described both direwolf and gray wolf from Natural Trap Cave. We know that occurs, but we know that's also rare because two big canids at the same site is rare, usually because of competition.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were wondering what our dogs actually were. And if you recall that figure that I threw up, the Natural Trap Cave wolves in those purple triangles were actually really sort of almost halfway between direwolves and the Beringian wolves. So one of our initial hypotheses was that actually maybe the wolves at Natural Trap were hybrids between direwolves and gray wolves. And as we know now, that is not the case. I'm not going to give too much of a spoiler on what they actually are, but it did have implications, you know, as things that people thought about, that paleontologists thought about, was there hybridization between dire and gray wolves.
Right. So meaning that, you know, these other canids, gray wolves, coyotes, kuan, obviously we know about dogs, but that their direwolves are essentially being isolated in the Americas for some unknown period of time, likely a long period of time. Yeah, so I mean, I've heard a lot of people talk about, try to sort out when exactly gray wolves came into the Americas. You know, when did that happen? Is it a quite late occurrence? Julie, what is, as far as La Brea, do you know what is the kind of earliest date gray wolves are definitely in La Brea?
So gray wolves are totally underdated at La Brea, and gray wolves are frankly underdated in the lower 48.
Yes.
We've got great dates on gray wolves from Alaska and from Beringia, the area up there that you're talking about. So Alaska, Siberia, northern Canada, we have good dates on wolves from there. But the lower 48, wolves have not been dated well at all. We know they're here by about the limit of radiocarbon, but we don't have, like, I think there's maybe like 2 or 3 radiocarbon dates on wolves in the entire lower 48. So it's a little frustrating, and it's actually one of the areas of research that I'm thinking about having some of my students go into and sort of figure out when gray wolves were in the lower 48. So when they came down from Beringia, and the timing and where they are.
Yeah. Blaine, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, that basically Julie answered exactly what I was getting ready to talk about and propose. There was a needed study to look at any of those specimens from the lower 48 to see, you know, for one, are they dated, and then try and date them if they're not, but then also just do some kind of a test to see, well, maybe those that were identified as gray wolf before are actually direwolf.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, there could be much later direwolves than we actually think. So, interesting. Okay. So then we kind of go back to something I guess Julie was talking about earlier with Lithophagus, which is, and we have a number of fossil specimens that are in the Americas, at which point we think we have isolation of gray wolf or direwolves in the Americas, and coyotes, gray wolves, dogs, kuan are all in the old world still, but we have a number of North American canid fossils that now leave us with the question of who are they related to, like Edwardiae, and number that we thought were ancestral to coyotes or gray wolves now seemingly would be on the direwolf lineage. I mean, and so that's something that we are going to have to think about and deal with as well, kind of moving forward, is what are those fossils related to? Where do they stand? So another question, which I know that Blaine is really interested in as well, is kind of this question of, if we say that direwolves are for sure an American species, genus, then is it North America, South America? What is the origin of the direwolf itself within the Americas? What is the relationship to these South American large canids like Naringi and Gezi, but also other canids that are across the Americas, fossil canids? So that's something that we haven't really sorted out. It looks like that the direwolf seems to be a kind of lowland, kind of lower latitude adapted species. We don't find many of them up in Canada or Alaska or anywhere else in the kind of further north, northern latitudes. So, I think it's probably a good possibility that they have some kind of South American origin. Blaine, do you have any thoughts on that?
I agree.
Great.
It'll be fun to explore.
Yeah, it'll definitely be something interesting. So as far as the extinction, like we said, the Guy Wilson Cave in Tennessee, we got pretty much the latest date that I would say is kind of not controversial and is of good quality, from about 12,800 years ago. And it looks like that extinction date is very closely related to the extinction of some other large predators, including American lion, giant short-faced bear. So it wouldn't be surprising if that was, in fact, the time period that a number of large predators are going extinct across the Americas. So the reasons for extinctions, we kind of ended the paper on this question of why did they go extinct while gray wolves really succeeded and flourished across North America. And so one of those reasons maybe, as Julie mentioned, they had a bit of an overlap, it seems, in their prey, but that once the megafauna prey species that they were going after went extinct, then perhaps that led to their downfall. They weren't able to adapt. Julie, do you have anything you want to add about dietary adaptation, or what do you think about the gray wolves learning to adapt to kind of mesopredator style dietary, gray wolf-like dietary regimes?
Sure. So that's a great question. And I think the answer is really not super simple. And I think that's because most people assume that the species that made it through the extinction kind of sailed through and did fine. But I think the reality is that most species probably did lose a lot of population density. They probably went extinct regionally. And coyotes are one of these, right? In the Pleistocene, they look a lot different than what they look like today. And so I think certain populations completely went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. And I think that's probably the same with wolves. I think a lot of the gray wolves that we have, that we think of as the Beringian wolves, a lot of their populations went extinct. And I think the ones that survived were able to get by on smaller prey, and moved down into the lower 48, where there was basically an opening because dire wolves were now gone. And so there wasn't as much competition for the herbivores that were left. So I think that wolves probably did experience a large extinction event. Gray wolves did. They just happened to have some of their individuals survive and then, expand out from there. And that's testable with genetics, but a lot of those Pleistocene wolves have genotypes that are different from the wolves that are around today. So we know that their subspecies actually probably did go extinct at the end of the Ice Age.
And as you're saying, we don't really know a lot about wolves in the lower 48. We have very little information on those. So that's an interesting, add that to your student project. So another kind of thing that we talk about a lot as far as why they went extinct is the potential that some kind of disease came in, either with coyotes, gray wolves, or even with dogs, that dire wolves hadn't. So they don't have, if they are not having integration with some of the wild canids, perhaps they didn't have the benefit of some of this adaptation to disease, or other. We know that, for example, the black coloration of gray wolves is coming from integration back from dogs. So perhaps the inability to interbreed with some of these other wild canids coming in caused issues as far as disease adaptations. And then, as we've talked about, having kind of competitive issues with gray wolves. Julie, maybe you just want to jump in real quick and say, what do you think about competition between gray wolves and dire wolves? Do you think gray wolves would have been coming in and competing for the same prey species?
I do, and I think that's why we don't see a lot of them in the lower 48 during the Pleistocene. I think they would have been in direct competition with gray wolves for prey. And the dire wolves were bigger, they were more robust, they were really good at catching those big Pleistocene megafauna. And so and we don't see dire wolves really up in the north, right? Like we don't see a lot of dire wolves. We see a few, but not the populations that we see down in the lower 48. So we don't see the big numbers in Canada and in Alaska. I don't think we see any in Alaska or Beringia of dire wolves. So wolves, gray wolves, really had their niche in the cold regions, and they did really well in the cold. And the dire wolves, not so much. So I think they really did partition their niches geographically in the Pleistocene.
I see our time. We're totally running over. So I'm going to try to speed us up.
Yeah, if you could, we can wrap
I'll
it
speed
up.
us up.
We could go ahead and get into the questions. Thank you.
Yeah, let's get into the questions. So then I would say finally, the arrival of humans and the potential that the arrival of humans may have had some issue as far as interaction with dire wolves. As an archaeologist, and with our date at Guy Wilson Cave, we know that we definitely have humans in the Americas by that time, and the potential that humans were adding an extra layer on top of that with competition for dire wolves when they may have already been a bit on their last legs is a possibility as well. So spoiler alert, we don't know the answer. And that's what that's the conclusion we came to. So I'll go ahead and just end it there. And sorry, I realized we really went over time there. Really went over time.
We thought this might happen, so we were prepared. We're going to go a little bit longer to answer some of the audience questions. David?
All right, we've got tons of questions from the audience. So as a reminder, if you aren't among the many people who have already done it, go ahead and leave a question in the Facebook comments or hop over to the Gray Fossil Site Twitter or Instagram. If for some reason you can't leave a comment on Facebook, I'm going to start with this fun one at the top of the list. This is from Sarah, who asks, could dire wolves, hypothetically, have grown massive with white fur adapted to Arctic conditions like in Game of Thrones?
I'm going to jump in here and say probably not, because from what we know about dire wolves, their range is more southern. So they're definitely a more warm adapted species than gray wolves. So I'm not saying they couldn't be albinos. I mean, that could be a possibility, but they likely weren't all that fuzzy compared to a gray wolf.
Yeah, I mean, I would. That was one of my big questions too. Looking when we talk about morphology of these canids, and they're so variable. So I'm a little saddened, but at the same time, I understand we're outside the envelope of variability. So I had a question. So Curtin had this idea that there was this east-west split in direwolves that was bigger species in the east and smaller species in the west. Does that seem to still pan out or not? Is that something that we can quantify at all?
Julie's probably the best person.
Sure, we can quantify it, but I don't think anybody's looked at it since Curtin looked at it. I mean, no. I would think Bob Dundas might have been the only one who would have, and I don't think he did. So sure, we can quantify that. I mean, size is something we can measure in the fossil record.
We have dire wolves from Maine. Maybe those would have the size.
I don't know. I mean, that's the thing is like not every place has that great Pleistocene fossil record, right? Because I imagine they were all over North America, at least all over the lower 48. But I don't know, what the fossil record looks like in places like Maine. So
yeah, and I think from what I remember, the Western. The kind of Western version of dire wolves it's coming from a pretty small, mostly La Brea, And, you know, the man, the myth, the legend, Jeff Saunders, will tell you that he has identified a kind of morphotype in the kind of Arizona, San Pedro Valley, New Mexico area that is much smaller and associated with human sites, with Clovis archaeological sites. And, you know, we've been talking about what does that mean? Is it a one-off? Is it a real, is it, you know, just a morphotype that's associated with the end of the Pleistocene? They're headed towards extinction. But I mean, Julie can comment on that. It looks like the direwolves, who are kind of at the end of their rope in La Brea, are doing well and bigger, and like they don't seem desperate in any way, right? And
Right.
so it's not clear. There might be lots of different morphotypes of direwolves out there that just haven't really been looked at.
All right. Our next question is from Jenny, who asks, could the evolutionary branch of direwolves actually have more species, but those sister species are either categorized wrong or just haven't been found yet?
I mean, it must, right? Blaine, do you want to comment on that?
So I think, you know, one of the issues we always run into is the difference between the morphological species concept and the breeding species concept differences. But certainly, I mean, yeah, that's possible that we could have more, and future genetic work could help to pull that out. But right now, based on the genetic work that's been done on the direwolves, they seem to be one group.
All right. Charlie asks, do we know how common tooth breakage is in direwolves compared to other canids, say, for example, Barophagenes?
So I can take this because my dissertation advisor actually worked on this question extensively. She looked at direwolf tooth breakage at Rancho La Brea and found that direwolves did break their teeth fairly often. So it was something that happened, and it was a hypothesis that she came up with, basically, is that there was more competition for food in the Pleistocene, which there were a lot of carnivores around. And when you're fighting over food, you're going to be eating what's left. So there's going to be a lot more bone eating, a lot more tooth breakage. Barophagenes, however you want to say it, were specifically adapted for cracking bones. So direwolves are like any dog, basically, who can eat bone. But Borophagus and other Barophagenes really specialized in cracking bone. And if you want to think about that in a modern analog, you can think about the spotted hyena. So I don't know what the data are on how often Borophagenes crack their teeth. Blaine, do you have data on that, or do you know data on that? So I'm not sure about them, but direwolves did crack their teeth more than the living gray wolf did. So there is data on that.
And we do have really great examples of direwolves just chewing the hell out of bones, in caves in particular, using those caves for dens. And actually, Guy Wilson Cave, which is one of the DNA producing sites, that is what this site was. It was a place where direwolves were bringing these bones back in and chewing on them.
All right. Now, regular listeners will note this is the time we would normally wrap up. We have so many more questions. We're going to keep going and answer some of these. Janice asks, Janice is one of our volunteers. Hello, Janice. Was there another canid that we might know of living at that time period that the direwolf might have been interbreeding with? And Sarah asked, is it possible to look at the DNA to find signs of hybridization with some other canid?
I would say probably the only thing that was in North America that we didn't look at was maybe Xenocyon. We don't have DNA from Xenocyon, but there are very few occurrences of Xenocyon. I think only in Texas, or there's not a lot of Xenocyon. I mean, possible, but I think probably South America is probably, Blaine might want to jump in, South America is probably a more likely place to see that.
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely need to look more into the genetics of the South American forms. And Protocyon would be a good example of one of those that makes it to the very end of the Pleistocene. But they do seem to be on a different path, at least for quite some time. But who knows? You know, I can't make predictions based morphology versus genetics. They're definitely quite different morphologically.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it seems like that they were isolated in the Americas for so long on their own that they became reproductively isolated, essentially, from everything that we've tested, which are the kind of typical North American canids. Now, Xenoceon, some of the fossil canids, Xenoceon, and some of the things coming from South America we haven't looked at yet because we just don't have DNA from them. So that's kind of a next step, I would say, yeah.
Very cool. Good questions. Grant has chimed in. Grant is the one who always comes in and asks questions about stable isotopes. Grant says, I'm curious as if you can see any dietary differences between gray wolves and dire wolves using stable isotopes.
So I guess that the answer is they are living in different places mostly, right? So there are some gray wolves in the lower 48, like we said, but there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on gray wolf stable isotopes in the lower 48 because there's just not that many of them. I think Rancho La Brea would probably be the best place, maybe Natural Trap Cave, although there's very few dire wolves at Natural Trap. Most of the wolves there are of the other variety. But it seems like they are eating a lot of the same things. Like they're all eating the megafauna. At Rancho La Brea, they're eating, you know, the big megafauna. And in the Yukon and in you know, Alaska, they're eating the big megafauna. So I can't imagine that they're actually really eating different things. I think there's a lot of overlap between the two in diet.
All right. Speaking of overlap, Ethan asks, is there something about canids that makes them liable to extensive convergence?
It's just a good look. It's just, it works, you know, when something works, it works. And it just seems like that form just, you know, not as Julie said before, not intentionally, they're not intentionally going towards it, but just evolution leads you there, you know, and I think we see it kind of over and over and over in this kind of form, this kind of slightly mesopredator dog-like form just works for a lot of things.
I think we also just see that in dogs themselves today, just the potential morphological plasticity of this group of animals and how relatively quickly that morphology can change based on selection, whichever that selection is.
Yeah.
On the subject of comparing dogs, Ben asks, does the new phylogeny for direwolves affect how you think about their potential social structure and social dynamics?
Yeah, I would say it makes us think about it. We know that gray wolves are social today. And I'd say the one thing that makes us still think that dire wolves probably were social was the numbers they were found in at the tar pits. And the study that was done by my former PhD advisor, Blair van Valkenburg, and Gus Mills and others, that basically did a playback experiment in Africa and found that the animals that came to the sounds of other carnivores fighting and herbivores dying in distress were all the group hunting carnivores. And that's actually what we see at Rancho La Brea. So dire wolves are more numerous than any other species, and it was a carnivore trap. So basically what that means is dire wolves are coming to the pits when herbivores were trapped in them. And so they likely came as a group, as a family unit, or some other kind of cohesive unit. So our guess on dire wolf social interactions is that they probably were social.
And the caves that they could enter into, you know, not the caves that they could fall into like Natural Trap, but the caves that they could enter into tell that same story, that they were really using caves as a place to have a den. And once we have their extinction and we have gray wolves across North America, we don't get them using caves extensively the same way. And so yes, on the social side, but not necessarily the cave preference. So that's kind of interesting.
All right, we've got just a few questions left, so let's see if we can get through these. And then I've got a question I'd like to ask before we wrap up. Sarah asks, can you compare the brain case between direwolves and gray wolves, and maybe infer something about their lifestyle and maybe why one is extinct and the other isn't? Is there much information to be gleaned from the brain morphology of these animals?
Have either one of you looked at that?
I see
Probably
Julie
not.
shaking. We got a lot of
I would
shaking
just
head.
say, I mean, like, I haven't looked at it, but I would say that's highly unlikely. I mean, there's nothing so incredibly different about the brain case of gray wolves and dire wolves. I mean, their skulls are so similar in so many ways. And like Blaine was saying, we'd really need to dig in there to find some sort of differences that we could recreate a phylogeny with to give an idea that they weren't very closely related. So I really don't think morphologically grossly there is a big difference. And frankly, we don't see that big of a difference in between things like, between a lot of different canids brains, especially canids who are social. There would actually be more convergence in the two brains of two social canids that were completely unrelated than sister species where one was social and one wasn't.
All right, here's more of a cultural question. Barbara asks, why would a book/TV series like Game of Thrones have chosen dire wolves as a feature of their story?
Cool, it's so cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're called dire wolves. I think they probably were in the north. Like, what's a kind of tough animal that works? Wolves, but it can't just be a wolf. It's got to be a dire wolf. Like, why don't we just make them dire wolves? That sounds awesome. And that's probably how it happened. I mean, at that time, I would say, before our paper came out, it was pretty. That's what we all thought. Like a dire wolf is a big wolf. Probably looks a lot like a gray wolf and probably acts a lot like a gray wolf and is just a bigger, tougher version of a gray wolf. So, I mean, you can't blame Game of Thrones for going with that concept. But yeah.
And I think I'll add to that Angela, you made the point earlier that dire wolves have been a staple of fantasy for a while. Dungeons and Dragons has had dire wolves for, I think, about as long as Dungeons and Dragons has been around.
Vampire direwolf, like serious predator in Dungeons and Dragons, serious points there. Yes. Yeah. And I mean, Grateful Dead, direwolf is like, the direwolf mascot logo for Grateful Dead is like a symbol of Grateful Dead. So yeah.
So there's this trend.
Yeah, I mean, I think, when I gave a talk previously saying, Game of Thrones has really made direwolves a thing, and like a bunch of deadheads just came for me saying like, we've known about direwolves for so long, and a bunch of, Dungeons and Dragons people. And I just want to like give them their dues that it's true. They've known about direwolves for decades.
All right, one last audience question. This is from Mason, who asks, what's next? What other canids or other groups should we look at genetically in the near future? So who's on your list?
Well, I think after this that Julie, Blaine, and I are going to have a little combo about South America. I think South America is high on the list of what's happening there. We talked a little bit about Canis gezi and Canis naringi and what those are. Those have also been kind of floating there as potential direwolves themselves, or very closely related to direwolves, or ancestral to direwolves, or something. Unfortunately, the preservation in South America is usually not great, and there are few specimens to kind of take a look at, but there are other, Blaine can kind of talk a little bit about there are other fossil species in South America that are interesting to kind of take a look at. Xenocyon would be interesting to take a look at if we can find some specimens in North America. But I think then, Julie talked about an important what's next is now determining all of these fossil canids that we had previously thought were ancestral to coyotes or gray wolves or other North American canids, that we were so sure, like Lepophagus and Warrior, that this is ancestral to coyotes. What do we do with those now? Are they on the direwolf lineage? So how do we sort that out? So Blaine and Julie might want to comment on that.
I think you said it great. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
me
just
too. Me too.
All right. I've got a question that I'd like to ask before we wrap it up. And that is, at the beginning of this talk, Angela, you mentioned that this was a huge paper. This was a 50+ author study. And my question is, why? What made this such a huge effort? What requires 50+ scientists from all over the world to come together to create a study like this?
Okay, well, there's lots of answers to that, but the very honest, real answer to that is this. First of all, we're a very collaborative group. We're a group of people who, none of us are experts. No one can be an expert in all things that are involved in this paper, right? I'm not a paleontological morphologist. I'm not a paleontologist. I'm not a paleoproteomics specialist. I'm not a lot of things, and the people on our paper are. And I think that what usually makes really great, exciting, the reason you see 50+ authors on a lot of these papers is because it takes that many people and that much effort combined to create narratives like this. And with this paper in particular, truly what happened was that a number of groups communicated and said, I'm working on this. And we said, we're working on that too. And this group is working on that too. So instead of creating 3 individual papers, why don't we combine forces, add all of our samples together, all of our people together, all of our data together, and then have a really great, awesome, huge paper. And that's essentially what happened. And so everyone who's involved in each one of these kind of 3 groups and 3 investigations all comes on board together. We have lots of really difficult Zoom meetings with people in Australia and California and the UK and Tennessee and like all over the place, trying to have, Zoom meetings where we're all discussing, what are we going to say in this paper? But yeah, I mean, I think it's just, there's a lot of data, and frankly, there's a lot of time and energy and effort that's gone into collecting samples. People like Blaine, who have been working at Guy Wilson for years, and Julie, who's been working on Direwolves for years, and all these people come together to kind of create a paper like this, and all of those people should be authors on that paper. So we're like, the more the merrier, everyone aboard. That's the answer.
That's a great answer. All right, I think there are a few more questions that snuck in under the wire right here at the end. So we'll see if we can put answers to those on Facebook. We'll see if we can get some responses to those comments. But I think we are just about at time. So Chris, Blaine, if there's anything else you guys want to say, otherwise we can go ahead and wrap it up.
Thank you both for joining us from the UK and Iowa. And let's do more of this work. This is exciting.
Yes. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, and thanks everybody for tuning in. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.